This lesson is about the coherence principle. Richard Mayer described principles for creating good e-learning. Using these principles can help make e-learning more effective. One of Mayer's principles is the coherence principle. The coherence principle states that lessons should only have content that needs to be there. It's tempting to put in long explanations, flashy animations, or dramatic music. According to the coherence principle, lessons should be free of extra words, extra stories, extra graphics, and audio, like music and sound effects. Learners learn better when they aren't distracted or overloaded. The coherence principle of leaving extraneous information out of e-learning lessons applies to text. Does all the text on the screen distract you? Are you trying to read it through the red circle instead of listening? Sometimes details like extra text are important, so learners often try to make sense of them at the expense of learning from the actual presentation. But shouldn't you use text to expand on key ideas? Not too much. Even if you know some great details, you should leave them out if they aren't appropriate for the lesson. The cognitive load theory suggests that people can only process so much information. If your lesson is matched to the learner's abilities, then adding extra information to it might overload them. They might get distracted or slow down to try to process it. They might not learn the important information. What if your lesson is boring and you want to spice it up? Research says that your learners will pay attention to your spicy additions, but not to the main content. So they don't learn what you want them to. Use other ways to engage learners. Some text on screen can help learners, though. Research shows that short summaries of the spoken presentation can help learners focus on what is important. Learners performed better when they were given an illustrated summary than when they were given the captioned illustrations and a text passage about them. Also, college students who were given one lesson performed better on tests than those who were given that lesson plus 2 other related lessons. So, feel free to include summaries and captions. This image violates the coherence principle. It has a lot of extra words that are interesting, but just more information than this audience can really use. Also, the words are really hard to read. The learners will likely just remember that social media has something to do with the brain, if they remember anything at all. This image follows the coherence principle. Only necessary words are included, and the graphic shows the relevant concept clearly. Learners can see where these parts of the brain are and how they relate. Think about it. What kind of text on screen helps learners? The coherence principle of leaving extraneous information out of e-learning lessons applies to graphics, too. Lessons should only use graphics that directly support the lesson. Will adding extra interesting details to a lesson help learners remember it? Mayer and colleagues found that college students actually learned less from their lessons containing highly interesting seductive details in comparison to a lesson with no seductive details. While this example is not a one-size-fits-all rule, it is not a bad thing to keep in mind when constructing lesson plans. More details do not correlate with better understanding and retention. In fact, it may hurt the learner's ability to recall important information. So stay away from adding irrelevant material in an effort to keep the learner engaged. Arousal theory states that something that arouses emotions will be more interesting because it is arousing. When the learner becomes more emotionally invested, they will put more effort into learning. Dewey argued against the idea that simply adding interesting material will translate to deep learning. He said, "When things have to be made interesting, it is because interest itself is wanting. Moreover, the phrase is a contradiction. The thing, the object, is no more interesting than it was before." A learner's interest cannot be added to a lesson like some sort of magical seasoning. Emotions can help the learner learn the wrong thing too, so adding emotionally arousing graphics to e-learning won't help learners. For example, it's pretty easy to see that these are instructions of what to do in case of fire. In this example, the pictures support what the words say and match them. The pictures are easy to understand and are close to the words. The graphics are helpful. Is this graphic helpful or hurtful towards learning? Unless the presentation is about the actor or about what he's doing, the picture won't help learners learn. The third guideline for coherence states, avoid e-lessons with extraneous audio. This refers to placing unnecessary audio such as background music or sound effects in e-learning presentations. Extra sounds overload the cognitive system. Learners are less able to pay attention to the narration because they are focused on the sounds. We know that overload occurs when too much information is being processed through either the visual or auditory channels. The graphics, narration, and music or sound effects will compete for limited cognitive resources, causing learners to not learn as deeply as those who are just exposed to the graphics and narration. According to a study conducted by Moreno and Mayer, background music and added sounds do not improve learning. They narrated one animation explaining the process of lightning formation and one animation explaining how hydraulic braking systems work. They added background music to each narration. The students who received either presentation without background music remembered more of the presented material and scored higher on solving transfer problems than the students who received a presentation with background music. Also, when environmental sounds were added in that represented different processes, for example, the sound of a gentle wind in the lightning presentation that depicted air moving from the ocean to the land, students who received the presentation without sounds performed better on retention and transfer than the group who received the presentation with sounds. To summarize, for the groups of students that have background music or sounds in their presentations, retention and transfer was much worse than when students received neither. Take a look at this e-learning example. Let's say that you are teaching a group of students about the water cycle. You explain each process represented on the diagram. Learners benefit from presentations with graphics accompanied by narration. Your learners are likely to focus on the concepts you are explaining to them and will connect those explanations to their corresponding visual on the diagram. Now imagine that sounds are added in to depict the different processes, such as the sound of rain to represent precipitation or the sound of water running to represent snowmelt runoff. As you explain each process, its corresponding sound plays in the background. Although this may provide a cool effect to your presentation, your learners are focusing more brain power on processing the sounds than they are processing the information you are providing and are less likely to retain or transfer. Think about it. Consider how extraneous audio impacts learning. Thanks for listening.